So today is all about operations now with complex numbers. Very, very similar to operations with polynomials, but now you have complex numbers. A complex number is just a number in the form of a plus bi. So a number in the form of a plus bi where a and b have to actually be real numbers. Like a can't be 0, b can't be 0. You can't have anything crazy with it. And remember that I is not actually a variable, but that I is the square root of -1. I is that imaginary number. So operations with complex numbers is like saying operations with imaginary numbers and numbers, just not attached to the I. So if I is the square root of -1, then you have to remember that I squared is the square root of -1 squared, which is the square root of -1 times the square root of -1, which is just -1, which you're allowed to have. So I squared is an actual number. I times I just becomes -1. So if you're simplifying, you could almost treat it like a variable. So on this problem, if I have 4 minus 3i plus -4 plus 3i, well, I can treat it like a variable and ask myself, what are the like terms? Well, 4 and -4 would cancel out. That's 0. -3i plus 3i, that would cancel out and just make 0. And 0 plus 0 is just 0. So complex numbers actually aren't that complex. You just treat them like they're like terms. That's it. And with like terms, adding, subtracting, multiplying, all the operations, it just goes back to the video from yesterday. So if you have -2 plus the square root of 9 plus -1 minus the square root of -36, well, the square root of positive 9 would be 3. So the square root of -9 would be 3i. So I'm going to rewrite that. Plus -1 minus, well, the square root of 36 is just 6, but it's -36, so I'm going to write that as 6i. And then I'm seeing, what can I add? Well, -2 and -1, that's just -2 plus -1, -3. And then I have 3i minus 6i. Well, 3 minus 6 becomes -3i. Complex number, but not that complex. Okay, over here on the other side with subtracting, you have to be careful that you're distributing that negative. So when I have 5 minus 3i, I'm not actually subtracting 2. I'm actually a negative means I'm adding 2. What goes with the 5? Not -2, but positive 2, so 7. And then I have minus 3i minus 4i, so -3 minus 4 would be -7i. Combine the like terms, combine the i's. In this case, combine the bi's, combine the i's. Like terms, that's it. Okay, right here, well, the square root of -1, we just said that's I, so rewrite that. Minus the square root of 81. The square root of 81 is 9. So the square root of -81 would be 9i. So I don't even need the parentheses on this problem. What's 7i minus 9i? That's just going to be 7 minus 10i. And that's it. So when I'm multiplying, this is where it gets a little bit tricky because I can just multiply 7 times 3. 7 times 3 is 21. And if this were x, well, 7x times 3x would be 21x squared, but it's an I, so 21i squared. And this is where you have to remember that I squared is just -1. So instead of I squared, I'm going to change I squared to -1. That's like saying 21 times I squared. Well, it's just 21 times -1. What's 21 times -1? -21. So you just have to remember, if you get an I squared, that's a -1. It just changes the sign. So what's positive becomes negative, and what's negative becomes positive. So if I have 3i times negative 5, 3i times negative 5, 3 times negative 5 becomes negative 15i. 3i times 2i becomes 6. 3 times 2 is 6, I squared. Well, I squared is just a negative 1, so I can take that out. That's just negative 1. Positive 6 times negative 1 becomes negative 6. Because that I squared that I had back right there, all it does is just change the sign because it's really negative 1. And I can't leave it like that because complex numbers have to be in the form of a plus bi, meaning that the imaginary number goes at the back. So I'm just going to rewrite this to negative 6 minus 15i. That's it. Over here, this goes back to yesterday when you had a binomial times a binomial. You have to just make sure that when you're distributing that every piece gets distributed to. So going through this, if I have 4 times negative 1, that's going to be negative 4. 4 times negative 2i is going to be negative 8i. 3i times negative 1 is going to be negative 3i. And positive 3i times negative 2i is going to become negative 6i squared. All that the I squared does is change the sign for this one piece. I squared is just saying that's a negative 1, and a negative 1 means that it's not going to be minus 6 anymore. It's going to change to a positive 6 because negative 6i squared just is a negative 1, changes the sign, so it becomes positive 6. And then it goes back to just looking at like terms. So negative 4 and positive 6 makes 2. Negative 8i minus 3i makes negative 11i. And that's it. Over here, the square root of negative 1, I'm going to rewrite that as just I. So I have 5 plus I times 2 minus the square root of negative 36 is 6i. And now I'm going to go through and start distributing. So 5 times 2 is 10. 5 times negative 6i is going to be negative 30i. I times 2 is positive 2i. And I times negative 6i is negative 6i squared. Well, on the last problem, when we had negative 6i squared, that negative 6i squared changed to a positive 6. Same thing over here. That I squared is going to change your sign. If it was positive, it would become negative. But because this is negative, it's going to become positive. Then what's 10 plus 6? 16. Negative 30i plus 2i becomes negative 28i. And that's it. When we talk about operations, we're just adding, subtracting, multiplying, and we're going to get into dividing down at the bottom in a little bit. Right here, distribute first and then combine like terms. So 2 times 3 is 6. 2 times negative 7 is negative 14i. Negative I times negative 4 becomes positive 4i. And negative I times positive 5i becomes negative 5i squared. Well, negative 5i I squared just changes the sign, so negative becomes a positive. 6 plus 5 is 11, and negative 14i plus 4i just becomes negative 10i. That's it. Over here, if you notice, the only change in these two problems is that this is a plus and this is a minus. That's it. If I'm still going through the steps, negative 6 times negative 6 is 36. Negative 6 times negative I is positive 6i. Positive I times negative 6 is negative 6i. And I times negative I is negative. Positive negative makes a negative. I times I is I squared. Well, I squared is just negative 1, so I could cross that out, right? Negative 1. which becomes 36 plus 6i minus 6i plus 1. And if you notice, 6i minus 6i, that's going to cancel out, and I'm just left with 36 plus 1, which is 37. So this one didn't even have an I, and if it goes back, notice in the middle, one was positive, one was negative. This goes back to conjugates and radical forms. Difference of squares. When the only thing that changes that positive and negative, your middle terms cancel out. And that's going to help us out on these 3 problems down here. And we'll jump into that in the next video.